In the final summer of 1944, on a volcanic island no wider than a man's endurance, the ground of Saipan shook day and night from American shell fire, and deep beneath that ground, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians pressed themselves into darkness, waiting for a fate they could feel but not yet see. The air smelled of damp earth, cordite, and fear. Steel doors trembled, lantern flames flickered. Outside, the Pacific War was turning against Japan forever, but inside Saipan's hidden fortifications, time slowed to the pace of hunger, exhaustion, and whispered orders. This is the story of the desperate last days inside those fortifications, where ordinary men, clerks, farmers, engineers, students, were forced to decide what honor, survival, and humanity meant when the world above them was burning. Saipan was not just another island. It was a linchpin, a dark, rocky stepping stone that placed American bombers within direct striking distance of the Japanese homeland. Every officer defending the island knew this. Every soldier felt it in the relentless urgency of their orders. When U.S. Marines came ashore in June 1944 under a sky ripped open by naval guns, the Japanese defenders did not rush the beaches in blind fury. Instead, they pulled back, methodically, deliberately, into a vast underground network carved from coral and lava stone. Months earlier, engineers and forced laborers had hollowed the island from the inside out, tunnels sloping down into blackness, reinforced chambers lined with timber, narrow crawl spaces barely wide enough for a man and his rifle. In these fortifications, the defenders believed, they could outlast any invasion. Above ground, Saipan would belong to the enemy. Below ground, it would remain Japan. Inside those tunnels, the war lost its roar and became something more intimate and terrifying. Artillery thunder turned into a distant, muffled growl, echoing through the rock like an angry sea. The men inside sweated constantly. The heat never left them. Water dripped from ceilings and pooled around their boots. Rats moved freely, fearless in the dark. Ammunition crates were stacked beside medical stretchers already stained brown from old blood. There was never enough air. Some soldiers counted breaths to stay calm. Others pressed their faces against the cool stone walls, imagining wind, imagining home. Many were barely trained, drafted late in the war, taught to obey without question. Now they waited, rifles clutched, listening for the sound that meant American flamethrowers were coming. Fear was everywhere, but so was discipline. Orders passed down the tunnel lines in hoarse whispers. Positions were adjusted. Machine gun teams rehearsed blind, memorizing angles and distances they would never be able to see clearly once the fighting began. Among them were men who had once been civil engineers, men who understood load-bearing rock and ventilation shafts, men who quietly reinforced a weakening tunnel wall or rerouted smoke through a hidden vent. They were not celebrated. No one called them heroes. But in that underground world, their quiet decisions kept entire sections alive one more day, one more night. Above them, American forces advanced with brutal efficiency, learning quickly that every cave and hillside could spit fire without warning. When U.S. units sealed a tunnel entrance with explosives, the ground inside shook violently, dust filling lungs, timbers cracking like bones. Sometimes the exits collapsed completely, trapping the defenders alive. Inside, panic surged and then was forced back down by shouted commands. Dig. Dig with bayonets. Dig with helmets. Dig with bare hands if necessary. The rock tore skin. Fingernails snapped. But stopping meant suffocation, and everyone understood that. Survival became a physical act, measured in inches of cleared debris and minutes of breathable air. As the days passed, food became a rumor. Rice rations shrank until they disappeared. Water was shared capful by capful. Wounded men lay silently to avoid wasting strength. And through it all, the knowledge settled heavily on every mind. No relief was coming. The Japanese fleet had been shattered in the Marian Islands. Air support was gone. Saipan was being strangled from the outside, and the fortifications that once felt invincible were slowly turning into stone coffins. Still, in the darkness, men held on to purpose. Some clung to duty, others to comradeship. A few to hope, thin and fragile, but stubborn. In those tunnels, history was no longer about strategy or empires. It was about endurance, about how long a human spirit could stand against pressure, heat, hunger, and an enemy that would not stop advancing. And as American forces closed in, pushing deeper into the island, the defenders of Saipan reached the moment where survival itself became a question, one that would demand answers far more costly than anyone had imagined. By the second week, the tunnels of Saipan no longer felt like defenses. They felt like wounds that would not close. The air grew thicker each day, heavy with sweat, mildew, and the metallic sting of cordite. Lanterns burned low, their flames starved for oxygen, casting weak shadows that made every tunnel look longer, narrower, more suffocating than before. Men spoke less now, saving strength, saving breath. Hunger pressed constantly, a dull ache at first, then a sharper pain that made thoughts drift and tempers crack. Some had not eaten a real meal in days. Others had gone longer. Rice was gone. Canned food had run out or been smashed by bombardment. What remained were scraps, roots dug from the ground above under fire, rainwater caught in helmets, the bitter taste of survival stripped of dignity. Inside these tunnels were not just frontline soldiers, but cooks, medics, radio operators, clerks, men who had never imagined themselves fighting a war underground. Some had written letters before the invasion, promising families they would do their duty and return. Now those letters felt like artifacts from another lifetime. The reality pressing in around them was far simpler and far crueler. Breathe. Endure. Obey. Every explosion overhead sent showers of dust down from the ceiling. Each tremor brought the terrifying question of whether this would be the one that sealed them in forever. When American flamethrowers were heard nearby, a low hiss followed by a roaring rush. Fear moved through the tunnels faster than sound. Flames did not just kill, they consumed air. Entire chambers could be emptied of oxygen in seconds, leaving men choking in the dark, lungs burning, hands clawing uselessly at rock. There were moments when discipline nearly shattered. A wounded soldier begged for water that did not exist. Another screamed in delirium, convinced he was buried alive even while sitting upright. Officers moved from chamber to chamber, faces drawn tight, forcing calm through sheer will. They reminded the men of orders, of honor, of the emperor watching in spirit. But beneath their steady voices, doubt crept. They could feel it too. The slow realization that the strategy had failed, that the enemy was adapting faster than expected, sealing caves, pumping smoke, cutting off every escape. The fortifications that were meant to protect them were now fixing their fate. And yet, in the middle of this collapse, something stubborn refused to die. Men shared memories in whispers, of farms in Kyushu, of narrow streets in Tokyo, of wives who made miso soup at dawn. These fragments of ordinary life became acts of resistance. Engineers examined cracked beams and found ways to brace them with scavenged wood. Medics fashioned bandages from uniforms stiff with salt. A young corporal, once an apprentice carpenter, organized a team to dig a narrow ventilation shaft toward the surface, knowing there was a strong chance it would be discovered and destroyed. He worked anyway. He worked because doing something, anything, felt better than waiting. Above ground, American forces pushed closer, learning the tunnel networks inch by inch, often at high cost. But below ground, Time stretched into something unbearable. Each hour felt the same. Each breath sounded too loud. Sleep came only in fragments, jolted awake by explosions or the cries of men dreaming they were home and realizing they were not. The psychological weight was crushing. Some soldiers wrote final messages on scraps of paper, tucking them into helmets or pockets, knowing they would never be sent. Others stared into the darkness, wondering when duty had turned into sacrifice without purpose, and whether there was any difference left between the two. By now, many defenders understood the truth they dared not speak aloud. Saipan was lost. The question was no longer how to win, but how to face the end. And in that realization, the war inside the tunnels shifted. The enemy was no longer only outside. It was fear, despair, and the painful knowledge that survival and honor might soon demand opposite choices. As June turned towards its end, the messages coming down the tunnel lines changed. They grew shorter, harsher, final. Senior officers gathered in the deepest chambers, bent over dim maps smeared with dirt and sweat, tracing positions that barely existed anymore. There were no reinforcements to wait for, no counterattack to plan in any conventional sense. Instead, the orders that filtered outward carried a terrible clarity. Hold what remained, prepare for the decisive moment, and be ready to die. For many of the men hearing these words, the shock was not fear, but confirmation. Confirmation of what their bodies had already learned through hunger and exhaustion, and what the constant American pressure had made impossible to deny. The fortifications had bought time. They had not bought victory. Inside the tunnels, reactions were silent and deeply personal. One soldier clenched his rifle until his knuckles turned white, repeating to himself that this was why he had joined, to protect Japan at any cost. Another felt a hollow space open in his chest, thinking not of the emperor or the nation, but of his younger brother who would never know how he died. Engineers and specialists, men who had once believed skill and planning could overcome any obstacle, struggled with a sharper internal conflict. They had devoted themselves to building defenses meant to preserve life and strength. Now they were being asked to turn those same defenses into staging grounds for annihilation. The question gnawed at them in the dark. Had their ingenuity delayed defeat, or had it only deepened the trap? Civilian refugees poured into the fortifications as American lines closed in. Women, children, elderly parents herded into chambers never meant for non-combatants. Their presence changed everything. Soldiers who had endured bombardment without complaint now struggled to remain composed as they watched children cry from thirst or cling silently to mothers too weak to stand. Medics triaged in impossible conditions, forced to choose who might live a few hours longer and who would be given nothing at all. In the darkness, distinctions between soldier and civilian blurred. Everyone was trapped. Everyone was afraid. And everyone could feel the island shrinking around them. Outside, loudspeakers echoed through the hills, American voices amplified and distorted, promising food, medical care, and life to those who surrendered. The words filtered into the tunnels, sparking furious arguments and uneasy silences. Some soldiers dismissed them as lies without hesitation. Others listened and said nothing, their faces hard to read. Surrender was unthinkable by doctrine, yet the reality around them made doctrine feel distant, almost abstract. A corporal who had patched tunnel roofs for weeks whispered to a friend that living might be the greater courage. The friend did not answer. He only stared at the ground, torn between hope and everything he had been taught since boyhood. Then came the final directive. It moved through the fortifications like a chill. Prepare for the bonsai attack. A last mass assault, not to win, but to meet the enemy face to face and die with weapons in hand. The tunnels erupted in quiet motion. Rifles were checked. Bayonets fixed. Men wrote their names on scraps of cloth or paper, pinning them inside uniforms so bodies could be identified. Some burned personal items to avoid capture. Others carefully folded letters they could never send, leaving them behind like mute witnesses. Fear was no longer sharp and sudden. It became heavy, settled, absolute. In those final hours underground, an unsettling calm took hold. Jokes were rare, but not absent. A few men laughed softly, as if at a memory only they could see. Others prayed. Engineers ran their hands over tunnel walls one last time, feeling the stone they had shaped and trusted, knowing they were about to abandon it forever. Every choice had narrowed to a single path, and once taken, there would be no turning back. What happened next would be violent, brief, and irreversible. But inside those tunnels, as boots scraped stone and steel clicked into place, every man understood that history was about to judge not the plans, but the people who carried them out. The attack came before dawn, when the island was still wrapped in that uneasy half-light where shadows feel alive and the ground holds the day's last cool breath. One by one, tunnel entrances opened like wounds, and from them poured the last defenders of Saipan, gaunt, hollow-eyed men clutching rifles, grenades, and bayonets worn smooth by nervous hands. Their bodies were weak, but their momentum was terrifying. Shouts ripped through the humid air, cutting through artillery smoke and palm fronds. For American troops on the line, it felt like the earth itself had erupted. For the men who charged, it was the end of waiting, the release of weeks spent underground, compressed into a few minutes of raw motion and noise. The fighting was chaotic and brutal, collapsing instantly into close-range violence. Guns overheated, grenades burst with concussive force that rattled teeth and blurred vision. Men stumbled over bodies, friend and enemy indistinguishable in the smoke. Some Japanese soldiers reached American positions and fought hand-to-hand, driven less by strategy than by the simple fact that stopping meant dying where they stood anyway. There was fear in their eyes, but also something fierce and painfully human, the determination to choose how the final moment would arrive. As daylight crept in, the scale of the assault became clear. Entire units were cut down. The attack broke against entrenched firepower, not with a dramatic collapse, but with relentless attrition. By mid-morning, the ground was silent except for wounded voices and the distant rumble of guns elsewhere on the island. Back inside the tunnel network, those who could not attack, wounded men, medics, civilians, waited in suffocating stillness. The noise above told the story even before word reached them. Explosions moved farther away, then stopped. In their absence came another sound. American demolition charges collapsing entrances one by one. The fortifications that had once been arteries of defense were severed methodically. In some chambers, dust drifted down like ash from a dead fire. Air thinned. Darkness deepened. For many inside, this was the moment when hope finally ran out. Desperate choices followed. Some officers ordered final acts of resistance, planning ambushes that never came. Others turned away, their faces unreadable, leaving individuals to decide for themselves. Civilian families huddled together, clasping hands, whispering prayers or apologies. Soldiers who had once debated honor and survival now acted in wordless finality. In isolated chambers, time stopped entirely. There were no tactics left, only endings, playing out in silence or sudden violence. The tunnels that had echoed with work, orders, and plans fell quiet, one after another. Above ground, American soldiers moved cautiously, marking sealed caves, listening for movement that rarely came. The fighting power of the defenders had been spent. Saipan was effectively secured. Yet even in victory, the cost was heavy and unsettling. The battlefield told a story of courage twisted by desperation, of a defense that endured far beyond logic or hope. The men emerging from the tunnels or found within them were not monsters or legends. They were exhausted humans, shaped and broken by choices forced upon them by war. By nightfall, the island was eerily still. Smoke drifted low across craters and shattered trees. The ocean continued its steady rhythm against the shore, indifferent to what had happened inland. Beneath that quiet surface, the fortifications of Saipan remained, empty, collapsed, or sealed, holding within them the final hours of thousands of lives. The tunnels had done what they were built to do. They delayed, they endured, they consumed. And in their silence, they left behind a question that would haunt survivors on all sides, about the cost of obedience, the limits of resolve, and whether endurance alone can ever be called victory when nothing is left to save.